Hello everyone and welcome to National Army Museum for today's Friday Insights. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member where you get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Now, today I am delighted to welcome Mark Milner to National Army Museum. Mark worked on the official histories of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Canadian Navy in the Second World War before joining the History Department at the University of New Brunswick in 1986. Until his retirement in 2019, Milner was the director of UNB's Military and Strategic Studies Programme, chair of the History Department, and director of the Gregg Centre for the Study of War and Society. In 2016, he was awarded the Admiral's Medal for his contributions to Canada's maritime history and was appointed an honorary colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Mark has come all the way from Canada just to be here today, so be extra nice to him, please. Oh, well. And now today he will discuss and challenge the supposed failure of the British Army to prevent the escape of the Germans during the Normandy campaign of 1944. Now, I did just want to say, I said about how you can support us. Well, luckily, in-person audience, you can support us today. When you buy a copy of Mark's book, The Second Front, from the National Army Museum shop, supplies are limited, so if you do want a signed copy, please make your way up to the shop at the end of the talk, and you get a signed one there. Now, before I hand over to Mark, just have to do a few technical issues. There will be time for questions at the end. Online audience, if you post them in the Q&A box or in the chat, I'll read them out to Mark at the end. Should we encounter any technical issues, which do sometimes arise, please bear with us. We'll work to rectify them. We'll keep you posted both in the room and online as they arise and we deal with them. With all that said, can I please have a massive round of applause for Mark Milner?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the National Army Museum for the opportunity. Can everybody understand my accent? Good, because sometimes I despair that non-Canadian historians have difficulty with Canadian English because they apparently never read it. Anyway, I've been described in the past as a senior scholar, and I was thinking about that the other day, about senior, I don't feel old. Senior, and that dawned on me, and this group will appreciate it. A senior scholar is when you've reached that stage where you can afford to buy a car that'll pass anything on the highway but a toilet. I hope you all pumped bilges before we started. All right, so this is a spin-off from a book I've been working on. Actually, if you read the preface to the book, you'll find out I've been working on the Normandy campaign since I was about 3. Because my dad was a veteran, and until the moment he died, he asked me questions about Normandy. And when I became a professional historian, he continued to hound me about Normandy. My father was a classic rural Depression-era kid and a bit wayward, and I don't think he had much to do with the downfall of fascism in Europe, but he had a hell of a time as a gunner. So we're going to look at that a little bit. So many of you are familiar with this, and I'm not going to rehearse it too much, but just to set the stage, I know you can't see this online, but this is the situation about the 12th of June, which is the best map I could find in my collection. So what we're going to talk about is the breakout down here to Avranches on the west coast of the Cotentin Peninsula, and then the swing of the American army around towards Argentan over here. And most of what I'll talk about is this area around Falaise, Argentan, which if you're watching this online, is kind of bottom right center of your map. So it's often talked about, the issue is trapping the German army. Much of it pinned up against the Anglo-Canadian forces along the northern front, trying to hold 1st Canadian and 2nd British Army from breaking out. But there's actually 4 attempts, I think, to trap the German army. I'm going to talk about all of them. I think there's some revelations in some of this. Particularly the long envelopment, which for me was an epiphany. It's like, I'd heard of the long envelopment, but never really learned that much about it. So we're going to talk about all 4 of those. They all end in failure, and somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 Germans escaped from Normandy. And the genesis for this is my father. I don't know that he used friggin'. He may have used a different word. But to his dying day, My father wanted to know why. His gun position was just northeast of Trun. If you go to Trun and you drive up the road towards Vimoutier, which I did about a month ago, again, there's a marvelous flat crest that's probably a square mile. And that's where all the guns of 1st Canadian Army were deployed, 2nd Canadian Corps anyway, the Polish guns. And they were firing on an arc of 245 degrees. Some of the batteries had their guns back to back. And some of them were firing over the top of each other. Germans all around. It's kind of like Fort Apache in an old cowboy movie, right? So why is it so important? Well, actually, it's about more than just trapping 7th German Army and 5th Panzer Army, which used to be called Panzer Group West, because by the time they try to launch the envelopments, particularly the later envelopments and the long envelopment, a huge number of German forces have moved south of the Seine. And I put them here not because there's going to be a test, but just to show you some of the scale of the forces that are moving into the area. So it's not just the armies that have been fighting the Allies, it's much of 15th Army from the Pas-de-Calais, but also divisions from the south of France, a headquarters from Bordeaux, Corps headquarters. They're all pouring into the area south of the Seine River because the Germans have a plan to actually build a series of defensive positions backing up to the Seine so they can cross it successfully and safely and then escape maybe to a new defensive line around the Somme somewhere. So there's a huge amount at stake. The first opportunity takes place just after Operation Lüttich, which is the German attempt to cut off the American breakout at Avranches. And if you look at the map, you can see Avranches on the left. This is the situation about the 8th, 14th of August. Charles Stacey, the Canadian official historian, described this moment, actually about the 12th of August, as one of the greatest opportunities of the war. By the 13th of August, American patrols are only about 10 kilometers from Falaise. They've actually come north across the Army boundary through Alençon, through Alençon, if you can see it here in the bottom right, if you're online, up to Argentan, and they're almost actually up to Falaise. And then Bradley panics. Partly because the guy in charge of this first drive, and I put down there 1st Canadian Army, that's what FCA stands for, is preparing for Operation Tractable. What you see in the top is Operation Totalize. The next phase is a big push down to Falaise. So the Canadians are threatening to break out and get to Argentan from the north. Partly because what Bradley's fearful of is this guy, Patton. He doesn't think he can fight. Now, we all hear of Patton as the great fire breather, but Bradley doesn't think very much of him as a combat soldier in a kind of fixed combat position. He can move fast, but he thinks he'll make a hash of any attempt to guard his left flank. Patton's not worried about it, because he's going to drive the Anglo-Canadians back into the sea. Fat chance the Germans have been trying to do it for 2 months and they hadn't succeeded. Anyway, but what he says is, he's fearful of an open flank. It's about a 25-kilometer open flank, with the bulk of the German panzer forces still west of Patton's army. So I cut him some slack for that. It's an anxious moment. Fearful of Patton's inexperience, because Patton's a big driver, but he's never really fought a set-piece battle before, and when he finally does in eastern France, it turns into a bit of a shambles. Fear of unexploded bombs. And if you read Bradley's memoir, he says, well, it's all this British ordnance lying all over the place and with timed fuses. Well, in fact, it's American ordnance with timed fuses that have been dropped 2 days before and would have all gone off. Fear of blue on blue. It's a curious phenomenon. I was reading some stuff in the American archives. We always think of blue as the enemy if you're from Britain and the Empire and Commonwealth, but the Americans dominate this, so the Brits have to basically suck it up, and red is the enemy. Right? So he's fearful that what will happen is that the Canadians and the British and the Americans will all bump into one another and start shooting each other, which is, well, many of you are soldiers, I'll leave you to sort that one out. And then he says, quite remarkably, it doesn't matter because the Germans are all gone anyway. Ballpark estimate, 150,000 still west of Patton. Figures are a little bit dicey, doesn't matter. So what happens? Well, then there's a bit of a race to the Dives River crossing. 1st Canadian Army launches a thing called Operation Tractable, and we'll come back to a map here in a moment, which reaches the high ground northeast of Falaise. And if you've ever driven that area and seen it, when you get to what's, I think it's the, it's a little airport there that they use actually for remotely controlled airplanes. And when you stand on the high ground, you have one of those things, it's a technical term that I often use, you have a holy shit moment. Sorry, my apologies to the people online. You stand there and you go, what? What? Falaise is over here. It's already bombed to a rubble. All the roads go through Falaise. The road to Lisieux is right in front of you. It's right at your feet at the bottom of the hill. And the Dives River Valley, which runs down in a wide opening, welcoming kind of rolling plateau with the Pays d'Auge on one side where all that stinky cheese stuff comes from, and the Dives River on the right, you're just thinking, why would you go and fight in the rubble when you can just launch yourself down across the plains of the Dives River? But they don't. But 1st Polish Armored Division is ordered to go to Trun, and 4th Canadian Armored is ordered to follow up. When the Allies land in the south of France on the 15th of August, 1944, the German army in France finally panics. They realize that they're probably going to get caught in a vice. At the very least, there's going to be the Allies moving up behind them, moving up behind Paris, and their route of escape is probably going to be cut off. The Canadians arrive in Falaise. The road to Lisieux is closed. I mentioned that. And finally on the 16th, Hitler orders a retreat across the Dives River. And I got a map coming up. You can see that a little more clearly. Eberbach, who's in command of 5th Panzer Army, orders 2nd SS Panzer Corps to move east already and reorganize itself at a place called Vimoutiers, which is just over that kind of escarpment at the edge of the Pays d'Auge, and prepare itself to counterattack back in to keep the gap open, or what he thinks is a gap. And also to hold the Canadians, 1st SS Panzer Corps is supposed to hold the Canadians and Poles along the northern edge of what's developing as a bit of a gauntlet. The only forces along the south, according to the German sources, are reconnaissance and light forces. So along the American front and the French front, weak security forces. So this is the situation as it develops. And I know you can't see it at home. I'll try to actually direct you if I can find it where I am on the map here. Right. Okay, this Argentan is kind of just to the left center of the map. This area along the south, this southern front's held by light security forces. Falaise is just to the north and to the left a little bit. Up here, 1st SS Panzer Corps is holding this. And in Vimoutiers, which may not even be on the map, Vimoutiers is right in about here. They're concentrating 2nd SS Panzer Corps to try to attack back in and keep the gap open. Most American forces are actually headed towards Paris. And it would be unkind to say that they're all headed there for wine, women, and song. There's a very good reason to drive east when there's no resistance. And eventually de Gaulle gets stuck in this. So Bradley's second attempt to close the gap takes place between the 16th and the 18th of August, 1944. Still an estimated 100,000 Germans west of the Dives River. And what Bradley does is he organizes a provisional corps of the 80th and 90th American divisions and Leclerc's Second French Armored Division to close the gap and to move on Trun. And when he issues the order, Leclerc says, no, I'm not going to Trun. My division will be destroyed. And when I first read that, I thought, gee, I thought you were there to fight the Germans. But it turns out that Leclerc's primary purpose in being in France is to liberate Paris. Second French Armored Division is composed almost exclusively of, European Frenchmen, some from North Africa, some from the metropolitan area of France. And their job, at the risk of being blunt, are to be the white troops who liberate the imperial capital. And Leclerc is not going to risk his division to try to stop the Germans in Normandy. So if Leclerc's not going to go to Trun, if my father had still been alive when I found this out, he would have been just apoplectic with rage, right? So delay follows when the Americans, it's 16th of August. The Germans are escaping. The Americans have a seminar on who's going to command it, because The original plan is going to be commanded by Patton's 3rd Army. When the Canadians send a liaison officer down to try to avoid the blue-on-blue stuff, Patton tells them to go the hell home. He says, you have no authorization. I don't see any paper. Get somebody to send me a message that says you're authorized to talk. Otherwise, get out. You know, I don't know what to tell you about that one. So he leaves. Then they have a big bun fight over who's going to command it. And on the 17th, the command is passed to the 1st U.S. Army. Major Leonard Giroux takes charge. Leclerc reluctantly agrees to support. You know, I'll do something, but. And the attack is delayed until the 18th of August. So nobody wants to go down there. So here's the situation by about the 17th to the 21st of August. The American attack comes down from Le Bourg-Saint-Léonard, down the bottom right-hand corner of your map if you're watching it online, up towards Chambois, which is right here, just in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. And that's about as far as it goes. It stops. What the Canadians do in the end, or the Poles do, the Polish Armored Division comes along that escarpment in the Pays d'Auge, which is a curious place for armored divisions to be, by the way. I've driven it a couple of times, and you kind of scratch your head and you're going, geez, why are you sending tanks through what is essentially bocage, closed fields, and rolling? You know, the heights above the plateau where the action takes place are really quite high. So the Poles get up in there, and I think it's a case, and I can't prove this, and don't quote me, I think it's a case where the Canadians really don't want to get in the way of the Poles. My dad bumped into the Poles a couple times, because my father, being somewhat wayward, and being in a field artillery headquarters, always had transportation, and was always busy trying to loot the battlefield before the combat forces were finished with it, because you could get $50 for a Luger from American airmen. So they rode on one of their foraging expeditions one day when a Polish armored reconnaissance unit came by, spraying the verges of the road with a coax machine gun. And they were told in no uncertain terms to get the hell out of the way. There was a war on, and then when the Poles wanted to find Germans and fight them. So anyway, the Poles get up on the Mace, which is, oh, sorry, let's get the wrong button. Up here, if you can see, it's on the right-hand side of your map at home. And begin to dig themselves in. And the best that the 2nd Canadian Corps can do, having captured Trun from the SS in a really nasty battle, is to send the reconnaissance regiment of the 4th Armored Division, the South Alberta Regiment, forward with a troop of tanks and a company of infantry down to a place called Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, which is just south of Trun. And by the time they get there, there's only 3 crossings left over the Dive River. And if you've had the opportunity to be there, you'll know that the Dive River is not very wide. It would be, in most places, just about as wide as one row of the chairs that you're sitting in. But it's deep. It's a sheer side. It's virtually an anti-tank trench with deep, sheer rock sides, about, most places I saw, about 4 feet deep. So if you put a vehicle in it, you're just going to nose into it and you're done. So you've got to go across the bridge at Saint-Lambert. You've got to go across the crossing at Moisy. And if you can see this at home, it's just actually where that big hatched arrow is going through there, where it says breakout attack. And at Chambois, there's only 3 crossings. So on the, next one. On the 17th, then, Coureur is ordered to close the gap with his infantry division, but he doesn't have any infantry divisions left. They're all shot to pieces. There's only 2 in 2nd Canadian Corps. 2nd and 3rd Division, and they are in no shape to go anywhere. So he ends up sending his armor down. And strangely enough, on the 17th of August, Montgomery tells Alan Brooke that the gap is closed. It won't be closed, actually, for another 4 days. And nobody told the Poles or the Canadians or the Germans that, so they just kept fighting. On the 18th, the Canadians take Trun. The Poles reach the Mace. On the 18th, the South Albertists push to Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. And the U.S. attack reaches Chambois and stops. And Leclerc is actually just east of Chambois with about 75 tanks. He's about 2 kilometers away from the Poles and just stops. So the Poles are still isolated. When the U.S. and Polish patrols meet at Chambois on the 19th, everyone says, Yahoo, the gap is closed. If you read my good buddy James Holland's book, which is a good kind of measure of where the literature is, he just says the gap's closed on the 19th of August. So, case closed. Good that the Americans did it. The only problem is the gap's not closed. It's estimated that on the 19th of August, the date at which the gap was considered to be closed, there were probably 65 to 75 or 70,000 Germans west of the Dives, and I've got the list there, you can see it on the overhead, of what's still stuck west of the Dives: 4 Army HQs, 2 Army HQs, elements of 5 Panzer divisions, 7 infantry divisions, and a para-division. Huge amount of combat strength. Not really well coordinated, but there's a lot of very good, desperate soldiers west of the Dives River at the time it's announced that the gap is closed. British Army is largely idle, and I deal with that in Second Front. British Army stops. The Canadians actually expect it to arrive to help. And Chester Wilmot, in his The Crusade in Europe in, I think it's 1952, says he can't understand why Montgomery did not give Guy Simonds or Harry Crerar a couple of British divisions to actually close the gap. But he didn't. Partly, I think, because the British divisions are exhausted. You guys just don't have a lot of people left. We have a lot of people left, but they're in the pipeline, so our divisions are weak. We actually have higher casualty rates in our infantry divisions than you do, but there are people in the pipeline. They just haven't arrived yet. In my darker moments, I think the real problem is that guy in the middle of the picture, Montgomery, whose protege is Guy Simonds, to his immediate right, an Anglo-Canadian, but a Canadian nonetheless, who's in charge of the Corps. Montgomery does not want to give anything to the guy on the far right of the photograph, Harry Crerar, who he describes as a good plain cook, who he intensely dislikes. And I have to say, in my darker moments, and we'll come back to that, I think one of the reasons why the Canadians are not reinforced is because he doesn't want to give Harry Crerar a victory, but I didn't put that in the book because I really can't substantiate that. That's just a gut feeling. So here we are by about the, what's the date on the map? There is no date on the map. By about the 21st of August, with the Canadians at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, bottom just to the right, south of Trun. The Americans, it shows that they're in Chambois, but the Germans actually use Chambois as an escape route, so I think they're actually just outside Chambois, pounding the crap out of the Germans escaping. So what happens is that the closure was never actually intended. Montgomery's concept of how to deal with the German army is to swing the armies like a big door and trap them all right up against the Seine. Pivot on Caen and swing around like a big barn door and trap them up against the Seine. It's Bradley's idea to do short envelopments, which he never pulls off. So I don't think Montgomery's heart is in closing the gap. And, I would have had to tell my father is that there was never any intention to send British, American, or French forces into the gap. It's just Currie's lonely little band on top of Hill 117 and the Poles on top of the Mace. Major Currie gets reinforced a little bit later. He gets another company of infantry, he gets some anti-tank guns, he actually gets a whole squadron of tanks. But Simonds is actually ordered not to commit his forces to the gap. He's ordered to hold half his strength for the drive to the Seine. So what happens is the gap becomes a gauntlet. And maybe that would have been better, and maybe it was better. Lieutenant Jake Summers, who is of the South Alberta Regiment, said from the top of point 117, he said, it was like trying to stop a buffalo herd. They weren't really interested in fighting the Canadians. They had to fight the Poles because they had to get up over point 262. But Major Currie sitting on top of point 117, and there's a belvedere there that the Canadian Battlefields Foundation has put up, and you can see the position. They're just shooting at people. I bumped into a little guy named Trooper Daly many years ago with a bunch of students, and we had chased veterans around Normandy for about 2 days, a busload of Canadians. They would stop somewhere, and then some guy would get out, kind of like me now. And they would say, this gentleman, Private Bloggins, was here on the day, and all that kind of good stuff. So we finally, after days of trying to get my university students in contact with actual Canadian veterans on the ground, we got to Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, and if you've been there, at the bottom of the hill, there's a kind of monument where Currie, actually the monument's just over here on the right, but where that Jeep is, where Currie gets his VC, and I said, okay, what we're going to do is the raptor approach. They're all gathered around the monument. There's 12 of you, spread out around the group, and when the bus Führer of the group says, okay, back on the bus, You all meet in the middle and trap the veteran. And it worked. And what we found was a very small man, a diminutive guy named Trooper Daly. And Daly had been there. He had been up on point 117 with Curry. And the students were all standing around with bated breath, anticipating Trooper Daly to say something. He had his South Alberta beret on with his badge and his Legion jacket and all the bells and all this kind of stuff. And I came up and I introduced us. I told them who we were, a group of Canadians, and what we were doing, studying the battlefields, and how we would like him to say something about his experience here at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. And he said, I've never told anybody what I did here. I've never told my wife. I've never told my family. And then I did one of the, I became a complete asshole at that point, and I said, we're here now. Maybe you should tell us. What do you do with 12 anxious faces and you're on the ground and here's a veteran? Geez, then he began to cry. And he said, all we did was shoot people. He said, cooks and bottle washers came down from Trun. We gave them a box of ammunition and a 50 cal, put them up on the hill on a tank and said, fill your boots. And most who did that fired a half a box of ammunition off and said, this is insane. I didn't come here to murder people. Because you said you could stand up there and you could watch the figures fall. And if you've ever fired a 50 caliber, you can actually walk it onto the target quite easily. I've had a chance to do that any number of times, actually, because I teach close to an army base. And some men reveled in the fact that they were actually finally killing Germans. He said most guys just said, this is bullshit. I'm out of here. I'm not going to do it. He said, we just killed people for 3 days. I don't know what happened to Trooper Daly. I don't know if his family ever found out. I know the students were moved and I was moved, and I felt bad about doing that ever since. Maybe it was the right thing to do. I don't know. I don't know. So, the Germans aren't trying to get rid of Curry, who's there next to the guy in the white sweater, the white shirt, who earns a VC. This is a picture of someone actually winning a Victoria Cross, and that's the road down in the center of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, and a Canadian cine camera guy taking film, which blew up in 1965 in the Great Canadian Archive fire. So we don't have it anymore. So the Germans escaped. About 75,000 struggled to get out. It's estimated about 50,000 were taken prisoner. About 10,000, found dead in that area between Saint-Lambert, Moisy, the Mace, and Chambois. And they estimate that about 5,000 of them were actually found around the foot of Hill 117 where Curry was. The water was not potable for the next 25 years. And when they came to clear the battlefield in September, they couldn't see the valley of the Dive River for the flies. They had to wait. So huge carnage on an enormous scale. But the good thing for Curry and his small band on top of the hill is the Germans didn't want to fight him. And for those of you who are kind of technical geeks, one of the ways they could tell where the Canadians were is because Canadian, British, American tracer lights up as soon as it leaves the barrel. So they could always tell where the Canadian and British and Polish positions were because they could track the tracer ammunition back to the spot. So the Germans are trying to avoid them. German tracer lit up some distance after. Anyway. So, what about the long envelopment, the last chance? Well, on the 20th of August, George Patton is actually across the river at Mantes, west of Paris, and he wants to go to Dieppe, and they should have let him go. What they decide to do, Bradley orders a thing called the long envelopment, and this is the part that most historians in the Normandy campaign miss, because if you, as one guy who interviewed me said, if you take the papers off the top of the pile, by the 20th of August, Montgomery and Bradley and everybody are focused on what do we do next. They're headed to Paris, they're headed to Germany. The Joint Intelligence Committee says Germany will collapse by maybe December. So you got to find a way to give them a kick. So they're all focused on getting east of Paris. And then de Gaulle turns up and says, we got to get to Paris because most of the French forces in Paris are actually communists. They have all the guns. If the communist forces of the interior take control of Paris, it's the commune all over again. It's 1870. And they won't respect the provisional government and we'll have a civil war. So you got to get to Paris and preempt another Paris Commune. So, but what they do decide is that the Americans, who don't have a lot of combat power in the area because it's all being directed east, decide that they'll take a shot at it with 5 divisions. The 19th Corps with 2 divisions will strike northwest between the Seine and the Risle rivers. And I drove a little bit of that really for the first time about a month ago, and it is a spectacular piece of countryside. It's almost completely flat. There are no obstacles along that stretch. I got a map coming up here in a minute. It's a great place for armored warfare, particularly if there's nobody in front of you. 5th Armored Division will come down along the south bank of the Seine, and the idea is if it goes well, the Americans will drive right to the sea, and you'll get a long envelopment and trap the Germans who are escaping from in front of the Canadians and 2nd British Army. Whoop. So if you look at this map, actually it comes out pretty good. The area you want to be focused on if you're at home is kind of just to the top right of center. For those of you in the audience here, this is the Risle River. I may be pronouncing it wrong. Comes out around Pont-Audemer and Honfleur. The Seine is here. Here's Patton. He wants to go this way, right up. Bradley even at one point says, we'll do a little whip around Paris and come up to Dieppe. Either one would have been perfectly fine. So one American Corps, not tech savvy. One American Corps is going to come up in this space in between towards Elbeuf, and the other one is going to come down along the Seine. And when they do that, when they decide to do that and assign this area to the Americans, that means that 2nd Tactical Air Force, 83 Group and 84 Groups, RAF, are excluded from that area. So this area of the long envelopment, which includes Rouen and the lower Seine, all down here, is in fact in the American airspace between the 20th of August and the 24th of August. The problem is that the Americans don't have the combat power to do anything about that. If you look at, I mentioned on there, if you look at the maps on the center marked the killing ground, that's before the 20th of August. There's an expectation you're going to drive them up against the Seine, and then you're going to slaughter the Germans as they're trying to get across. And this is a typical kind of measles map that you often see. These are vehicles. The shambles in the bottom left is actually not the Falaise Gap. That's the area behind Vimoutier. That's the area that gets hammered by 2nd Tactical Air Force as the Germans begin their initial retreat. And the Canadians reported that some of the conditions in that area were as bad as anything on the other side in the Dives River area. So that's supposed to be where it happens, but it doesn't. The area between the Risle and the Seine is affected by the allocation of it to U.S. 9th Tactical Air Force. The RAF is forbidden to operate there, except there's a few RAF home-based night operations with 2 engine aircraft over there. They drop flares, they drop some bombs, they're kind of tracking what they're doing. If you read the literature, they'll tell you that we couldn't do anything because the weather was bad. Everything I could find out about the weather was that it was rainy on the 21st, but after that it was good flying. And in fact, the RAF patrols over it at night seem to take place regardless of what the weather conditions are. But here's the problem. U.S. 9th Tactical Air Force is too stretched to do the job. Their airfields are way back south of Avranches. It's too far for them to reach. And on top of that, they have to support the drive to Paris. And then a huge portion of the U.S. Army Air Force is actually patrolling the Loire River because there are only patrolling and reconnaissance forces holding that southern flank of the American drive. So they do a lot of that securing the southern flank by air power. So in fact, there is no American interdiction of the Seine crossings during the so-called long envelopment. U.S. 19th Corps meets at Neuburg on the 28th of August with the Canadians, and the Germans are gone. I'm going to come to that in a minute. I like this picture of the sergeant here. You can see the Canadian sergeant second from the left. He's got his cuffs rolled up. His tunic is open. He's got his pants rolled up. One, he doesn't have a T-shirt sticking out from the bottom of his tunic. Certainly not in the RCR, and most RSMs and the guards would probably freak out. There's a marvelous story of, I got a few minutes. Marvelous story of when I think it's 51st Lowland Division, Highland Division, comes into the Scheldt battle, and there's an account of an officer, and it's their first battle, and forgive me if I'm wrong division, but he arrives and he's all blancoed, and he's got his webbing on and his pistol, and he's all, prim and proper, and he's stepping off the landing craft into the mud, and he's kind of squishing his way through. And this Canadian comes running up to him with his beret on the back of his head, a woolly sweater down below this tunic, a pair of rubber boots on, rolled up, his cuffs turned up, and his pistol in his pocket. And he's covered in mud. And he goes, "Welcome, sir." And the guy looks at this fellow in horror, because the guy's been fighting in the Scheldt estuary for 2 weeks, and you just don't look good after doing that for a while. Okay, so the long and short of it is, maybe I spent too much time talking to my dad, because he was a good soldier spike type. We can talk about that later. The Americans assessed this afterwards, and they said only a massive concentrated air assault on the German forces might have made a difference. Allied air forces with more night reconnaissance and night attacks could have effectively prevented most of the German equipment from crossing. That's the study they did in 1945. So here's the map, and it's not very good. I took it from that American study. Rouen is in the center. This is the escape of personnel, and it generally is a reflection if the lines are fatter, there's more Germans escaping. If the lines are thin, there are fewer Germans escaping. The little lines down to the left towards the mouth of the Seine River are all the little small crossings with rafts and canoes and barges and God knows what else. But most of the Germans actually escaped through Rouen and through Pont d'Arche, which is just the second bulge from the right. And a few are actually across at Les Andelys, but not very many. When 2nd Tactical Air Force arrives on the 25th of August, the RAF narrative says the situation around Rouen on 25 August resembled the scenes of destruction seen around Vimoutier 7 days earlier. And they claim they actually halted crossings on the river. It was a feeding frenzy for air power. Attacks continued day and night for 3 days. It's suggestive of what might have been accomplished had there actually been air power at the Seine crossings between the 20th and the 24th of August. So, cost of failure. 90% of vehicles that reached the Seine crossed. 85% of tanks that reached the Seine crossed. 95% of personnel that reached the Seine crossed. Estimated at 225,000 men. And that's not the Germans, of course. There were Germans on the other side, mostly from 15th Army. And the 1st Canadian Army has to actually push them back like a piston in a cylinder, right? And then they go up through the Scheldt and they escape again when 2nd British Army stops at Antwerp and doesn't close the South Beveland exit. Anyway, so why? Well, there's a lot of chaos in the final stage of the Normandy campaign. There's no question. And I'm not here to armchair general. I'm just here to answer that question that my father had. If it was so friggin' important, how come it wasn't closed? Well, the British Army's badly bruised, and it's out of place. The British Army cannot intervene in this. It's been squeezed out. It's been squeezed out twice. When the Canadians, the Poles, and the Americans kind of link up along the Dives River, and then when they link up again at Le Neubourg and Elbeuf. 2nd Army is trying desperately to get across the back end of the American 19th Corps, 15th Corps. And there's huge traffic jams. It's the kind of stuff that would actually get you sacked in a training exercise. And it turns into a real disaster. And then ultimately what the Americans do is they go east. And Leclerc goes east, and they go to liberate Paris. Then ultimately the Americans decide they don't want to have anything to do with the British or Canadians, and they go east. And that's the broad front, narrow front. The Paris uprisings have a huge impact on this. The imminent German collapse has a huge impact on this. And I don't think Montgomery was interested in giving Harry Carrera a victory. And I've talked about that in the book because the Canadians made a complete nuisance of themselves in the 1920s, claiming that Canadian Corps won the First World War. One British general carped that the Canadians think the BEF was the Canadian Corps and a few supporting British formations. And we did that. Sorry. I think we became quite tiresome. And there's just a little echo of that in the documents in the Second World War, that we can't give these bloody Canadians anything to crow about because they'll claim they won the Second World War too. So there you go. And the final one, Gunner Milner in Normandy in July 1944. Questions? Thank you.